scruffy look.
One of the most commonly praised aspects of TCW is its humanization of the clones. TCW fans often cite this as one of the show's greatest strengths. The clones are no longer faceless soldiers, but individuals with names, personalities, friendships, fears, and doubts. They joke with one another, they form bonds with their Jedi commanders, and even question the morality of the war they are fighting. On the surface, this seems like a mature, thoughtful evolution of the Clone Wars concept. After all, giving the soldiers inner lives should make the conflict more tragic and emotionally resonant. But when you step back and examine the implications of this portrayal, a serious problem emerges. Because TCW does not simply humanize the clones, it fully acknowledges their humanity and then does absolutely nothing with the consequences of that acknowledgement. The show wants the emotional benefits of humanized soldiers without engaging with the political, ethical, and social fallout that would inevitably follow. The result is a galaxy that feels oddly hollow, a republic that openly relies on a slave army, a Jedi Order that commands it, and a civilian population that never meaningfully reacts to any of it. This contradiction doesn't just weaken the Clone Wars era, it fundamentally undermines the believability of the Republic, the Jedi, and the war itself. From its earliest episodes, TCW makes a deliberate choice to depict clones not as conditioned weapons but as people. They have distinct personalities, moral opinions, emotional attachments, and personal loyalties. Clones like Rex, Fives, Echo, Waxer, Boyle, Hardcase, Tup, and dozens more are written as relatable human beings. They laugh, they argue, they disobey orders on moral grounds, and they openly reflect on their purpose. This is not subtle humanity, this is more explicit personhood. And that's where the problems begin, because these men were born in vats. Because these men were born in vats, they were denied civilian life and their property of the Republic. If these are people, and the show insists that they are, then the clone army is not just tragic, it is institutionalized slavery on the galactic scale. Now, of course, this can also be applied to the expanded universe's depiction of the clone army. The Republic did use institutionalized slavery for a war, and once that reality is acknowledged, it becomes impossible to ignore the question that TCW never answered. Why does no one in the Republic object to an institutionalized slave army? One of the most glaring issues is how little indoctrination the show actually depicts. Real-world child soldiers require extensive psychological conditioning. Loyalty does not simply happen by default, yet TCW presents clones who are thoughtful, clones who are capable of dissent and aware of their expendability. Umbara is a perfect example. During the Umbara arc, clones openly question their orders. They question Krell, and by the end of the arc, their place after the war itself. Dogma, Fives, and Rex debate whether following Ponkrell's commands is morally acceptable. They are fully capable of recognizing that they are being used as disposable assets. But here's the problem. If clones can recognize that reality, then they are not properly indoctrinated, and the system should not be stable. There should be desertions on a massive scale. There should be more clones like Slick from Season 1. Mass refusal, psychological breakdowns, radicalization, underground movements, something. Instead, Umbara ends, Krell is killed by Dogma, who realizes he was just a pawn, and the war continues as if nothing was exposed. The show, like everything else, touches this issue and then just walks away, just never follows it up again. Perhaps the most explicit acknowledgement of the problem comes when Padme Amidala raises concerns about the clones' treatment after the war. Padme advocates for better treatment for injured clones, recognition of their personhood, and the ethical responsibility the Republic has for them after the war. This really should have been the turning point. In a functioning political system, Padme's stance would have triggered Senate debates, media coverage, public outrage, opposition blocs. Instead, it's just treated as a character moment rather than a political earthquake that it would have been. Now, of course, you could say that, well, nothing happens because the Republic is corrupt. And yes, I can agree with that, but that doesn't really explain away why the public didn't have any sort of reaction to this. The fact that their government are using slaves to fight their war. Padme's concern is acknowledged in that one episode and then is quietly sidelined. There is no sustained clone rights movement, no public backlash of any kind, there's no shift in policy. The clones just remain Republic property and the war machine keeps on turning. The show introduces the moral dilemma and then just refuses to follow it through. It refuses to disrupt the status quo. The Umbara arc is often cited as one of TCW's best storylines, and it's focused almost entirely on clone perspectives. But Umbara almost unintentionally exposes the show's biggest flaw. On Umbara, the clones are ordered into suicidal assaults. They're deliberately sacrificed by Krell, and then they realise they are being treated as expendable assets. This is exactly where a story about clone slavery should have exploded out into the wider galaxy. Instead, the arc resolves internally. Krell dies, and that's the end of the story. There's no consequences beyond that. There's no Senate inquiry into Jedi authority, though you could say that that was Palpatine's doing. There's no civilian reaction to clones being used as cannon fodder. There's no philosophical reckoning within the Jedi Order. Umbara proves the clones are people, and then traps that realization inside a bubble. The Jedi fare especially poorly under scrutiny. TCW wants the Jedi to be compassionate mentors who care deeply about their clones. Jedi like Anakin, Obi-Wan, Plo Koon, and Ahsoka are shown forming bonds with clones and treating them with respect. But this really just makes the situation worse, because if the Jedi genuinely believe the clones are people, then they are knowingly commanding a slave army. They're not ignorant, they weren't deceived, and they are definitely not powerless. They just accept it because the narrative requires them to. In the EU, this tension was uncomfortable on purpose. Jedi often kept emotional distance from clones precisely because acknowledging their humanity made the situation ethically unbearable. And couple that with the fact that the rank and file clones in the expanded universe are portrayed completely different to the ones we see in TCW. The only expanded universe equivalent to the TCW clones would be the clone commandos and ARC troopers, as they are allowed to have free will and they form personalities. Delta Squad from the Republic Commando game is a perfect example of this. TCW removes that distance, but never replaces it with accountability. The Jedi are framed as tragic victims of circumstance rather than active participants in an immoral system. What about the Republic citizens? What's their reaction to the Republic using a slave army? The clones aren't a secret. They're seen on Republic worlds, they're seen in spaceports, they're on the holonet. They are seen interacting with civilians. The clones speak like ordinary people, they express fear, they joke, and they mourn their dead. And yet, there are no protests, there's no journalists investigating, there's no activist groups for clones, there's no public discourse of any kind. In any believable society, the revelation that your government is mass-producing sentient beings to fight a war would be one of the greatest scandals in history. Instead, the galaxy reacts with indifference. This silence only works if the clones are dehumanized or rarely show any sort of humanity. This silence only works if clones are dehumanized, but TCW refuses to dehumanize them, which makes the silence nonsensical. What makes this more frustrating is that TCW knows this is an issue. The show raises clone existential questions. It introduces political objections, and it shows moral discomfort. They acknowledge clone individuality, and then repeatedly refuse to follow through. Every time the story approaches systemic critique, it pulls back. Why is that? Because actually engaging with the implications would force the show to criticize the Republic, to undermine the Jedi, and to complicate the war beyond good versus evil. It stops making the war black and white. That's a level of discomfort the series isn't really willing to sustain. The Expanded Universe handled clones differently and more believably. The Expanded Universe clones were more emotionally restrained, they were more clearly conditioned and brainwashed, and they were treated explicitly as tools of the state. Their humanity existed, but it was suppressed. It was tragic and it was subtle. Because of that restraint, the moral horror felt intentional rather than accidental. If TCW had followed through on its own logic, it would have been forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. The clones are moral agents who are being used without consent. Instead, the show introduces the inhibitor chips. On paper, the inhibitor chips are meant to explain Order 66. In practice, they function as a narrative escape hatch, a way to preserve the Jedi's moral image while avoiding the consequences of clone autonomy. Before the chip retcon, the implication was clear. Clones followed Order 66 because they were conditioned from birth. That conditioning was horrific, but it was at least consistent. It framed the Republic as complicit in creating soldiers who could be turned against their Jedi commanders, and it allowed clones to remain tragic participants in a system designed to erase their choice. Now, clones are not responsible, they're just victims of mind control. It actually undermines every existential question the show previously raised. Because if the clones are just mind controlled at the critical moment, then all of these earlier moments of doubt, individuality, and moral awareness become disconnected from the larger system. The arc involving Fives discovering the truth about the inhibitor chips should have been one of the most politically explosive events in the entire Clone Wars. Instead, Fives is discredited, isolated, framed as unstable, and killed, and the galaxy just moves on. Once again, the show introduces a premise that should shatter the Republic, and then resolves it by removing the individual who raised it. One of the most quietly disturbing aspects of TCW is how often clones are framed as having choices when they clearly do not. In the show, the clones choose to stay with their units, they choose to stay loyal to the Republic, and they choose to follow Jedi they respect. But these choices occur within a system where they have no civilian identity. They have no legal rights. This is not freedom, it's just manufactured consent. By presenting clone loyalty as voluntary, the show reframes slavery as devotion, and this reframing only works if no one in-universe questions it. TCW repeatedly suggests the system isn't the problem, only individuals are. Pong Krell is cruel, and Tarkin is a cold, unfeeling individual. But the structure is untouched. This framing is incredibly convenient for the show. By isolating moral failure to bad actors, the show avoids asking whether the entire clone army is unethical. If the problem would only just Krell, then removing him fixes everything. But the Umbara arc proves the opposite. The system allows someone like Krell to exist and command absolute authority over sentient beings with no legal protection. In a real society, Umbara would have triggered oversight reforms as well as limits on Jedi command. Instead, the lesson becomes, be more like Rex, don't be like Krell. That's not a systemic critique, it's moral individualism used to dodge accountability. The Kaminoans are slavers without consequences. They engineer sentient beings and treat clones as inventory. This is just slavery in everything but name. And yet, the Republic continues business as usual, while the Jedi doesn't question the ethics of continued production. Even when Lamassu openly discusses clone replacement rates and losses, no one reacts as if this is monstrous, because the show can't afford to make the Republic look that bad. The Kaminoans should be among the most controversial figures in the war. Instead, they're just treated like morally neutral contractors. TCW humanizes the clones, and then pretends the galaxy doesn't notice. It acknowledges clone suffering and then refuses to let it matter. It raises ethical questions and then resolves them with silence. By doing so, the show doesn't make TCW deeper, it just makes it less believable. A republic that openly uses a sentient slave army without any sort of backlash is not a tragic democracy, it's just a narrative convenience. And by refusing to follow through on its own ideas, TCW turns what could have been a powerful indictment of war into a contradiction it never, unfortunately, resolves.
Stuck-up, half-witted, scruffy-looking nerf herder.
Who's scruffy looking?